Okay, this video is going to get you through the first part of chapter 19, which covers the blood vessels in the Merriam textbook. So to start out, you have what's the function for the blood vessels, and really it's the blood's supposed to be in there, and it's supposed to be transporting the blood throughout the body. Your definition for arteries versus veins, it's a direction thing. Arteries are taking blood away from the heart. If it helps you to remember it, artery and away both start with A, so they go together. Veins are taking blood back to the heart. Keep in mind, generally speaking, arteries are going to be red in the textbook and veins are generally going to be blue. But remember, the color really means is the blood oxygenated or deoxygenated. It doesn't really mean artery versus vein. So that can get you in trouble if you don't remember what the color actually means, because the pulmonary circuit, the coloring is backward and the arteries end up being blue and the veins end up being red in the pulmonary circuit. This picture is showing you a cadaver dissection. Everything's labeled, but you kind of have to understand what the abbreviations are. This one right here is the abdominal aorta, which also tells you where we are, just in case you couldn't figure it out. This is the right kidney. This is the left kidney up over here. This is the inferior vena cava. And so abdominal aorta, it's taking blood away from the heart. So it's an artery. It happens to be the largest by diameter vessel in the body. Inferior vena cava is taking blood back to the heart. It's one of the larger veins in the body. Okay. There are also other vessels in the body. They're sort of intermediate in size or the smallest vessels. Capillaries are the smallest vessels. They're actually so small that the blood cells tend to have to fold up to go through them, or they have to go through single file to fit through. Their walls are the thinnest out of all the blood vessels, which also aids in their function, because this is where exchange of materials takes place. This is where oxygen either gets on or off, where nutrients go through. So that thin wall actually helps them do all of that. Arterioles are small arteries. They are the connecting branches between arteries and capillaries. And then venules are small veins. They connect the capillaries to the veins. So this picture is showing you a capillary bed. The arteriole is what leads to the capillary bed. The venule is what leads from the capillary bed. Okay, your three basic layers of a blood vessel. So anytime you see tunica, that word means jacket. So it's a layer that you're going to have around something, in this case, the blood vessel. Intima means intimate. It is in intimate contact with the blood. So it is the innermost layer of a blood vessel that is in intimate contact with the blood. It is endothelium, so that's simple squamous epithelial tissue. Slick surface, we're preventing platelet plugs from forming. We're just trying to make sure blood moves through. That layer does also help to form the venous valves when you're talking about veins that you can see in this picture. Tunica media in veins is fairly skinny, and arteries tends to be really fat. The tunica media is critically important for regulating blood pressure on a second-to-second basis. This is where the smooth muscle is that can do vasoconstriction, which is where it contracts, or vasodilation, which is where it relaxes. Last up, you have the tunica externa. This is mostly going to be elastic tissue. It's very stretchy. We've got a lot of pressure in a lot of our blood vessels, so we need them to be really stretchy so that the pressure of the blood doesn't just make them rupture. All of the blood vessels are going to have a fair amount of elastic tissue to them, but a lot of the arteries have even an additional amount because of that high pressure inside of there. Next thing I gave you was this picture to label. So one of the first things that I want you to be able to notice was, even if this were not color-coded for you, you should be able to tell the difference between an artery and a vein for a couple different reasons. One, veins have valves. So if you see a vessel with a valve, it's got to be a vein, because arteries don't have that. This is one of our adaptations because the pressure on the venous side is so low that we need a way to catch blood so it doesn't fall all the way back down to your feet, and the venous valves help do that. Two, the muscle in the tunica media on the artery side is much thicker than the muscle in the tunica media on the venous side is going to be. Even if you were looking at real arteries and veins in cross-section, you should be able to tell the difference between an artery and a vein, even if they didn't cut through a valve, because the muscle thickness is just so much thicker in an artery than it is in a vein. So again, even if it weren't color-coded, you should be able to tell the difference. Also, huge lumen inside the vein. Remember, the lumen is where the blood goes. relatively small lumen. In an artery, pressure is higher. That's partly the reason why. We just need the blood to get where it's going on the artery side versus on the veins. Your book actually at one point calls them blood reservoirs. They are places where we can collect blood and just kind of hold it for periods of time, because sometimes you don't need your blood to be moving in, I don't know, an expeditious fashion. It can be moving fairly slowly, and so this is sort of a place where they can pool. The capillaries, they are just endothelium, and that's it. They don't have a tunica media, they don't have a tunica externa. It's just the endothelium, and that's it. And again, that's because we don't want a thick wall. That would prevent us from doing all of the exchange that we need to be able to do. So I mentioned the next two words already in the notes. Tunica media carries out vasoconstriction when the smooth muscle contracts. This is going to tend to increase blood pressure. There are some times when they will actually constrict so much that it stops blood pressure past a certain point and makes that blood pressure zero past that point. That's not okay when that happens, but generally speaking, when we do this, we're going to be increasing blood pressure. Vasodilation is going to tend to drop blood pressure. This is when that tunica media relaxes. I'm going to skip past the questions. Next thing your book does is it mentions that there's a few different kinds of arteries that occur in the body, and what I want to focus on is the different tissue makeups. I like this picture from your book because it's showing you the different types of tissue that makes up the types of arteries that you have. So first off, arterioles are really small. The wall is relatively thin. They've got the least amount of tissue out of all of them. These are the ones that are leading us to the capillary beds. They do help regulate blood pressure, and in fact, the biggest drop in blood pressure happens in the arterioles. We'll talk about that again later on. From there, what I want you to notice is muscular arteries have the most smooth muscle compared to any of the other tissue types that are present there. And then the elastic arteries, they have more elastic tissue as compared to any of the other arteries that are on there. So they are named based on which tissue they have the most of present in them. And then that's trying to tell you also what their function is. So think about what elastic tissue is going to do for you. It's going to be stretchy. And when elastic tissue stretches, it wants to recoil next. So the elastic arteries are going to be right next to the heart. When the heart pumps blood into those elastic arteries, they're going to stretch with the blood that just got pumped into them. And then that elastic tissue is going to recoil and push the blood. The blood can't go backwards though, because the valves in the heart are going to prevent that from happening. So that recoil is going to keep the blood moving in a forward direction. So that elastic artery is an auxiliary pump, is the way your book describes it. It keeps the blood moving in a forward direction. The muscular arteries are all the named vessels that you guys are going to be learning the names of later on, like the brachial artery, the femoral artery, all of those nice little guys. Those help, again, regulate blood pressure. They have a big old function in that, and they get the blood to all the main tissues in the body, like the leg, the arms, all of that sort of stuff. All right. Primary function of the capillary bed is exchange of materials. That is their job. Capillary beds come in three different types of leakiness, essentially, but most of your capillary beds are pretty darn leaky, and things are going to be coming in and out through either holes or pores or fenestrations or sinuses or something. A lot of the plasma that's floating around in the blood is going to be leaking out through some of these holes, and it's going to become interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid, whichever one you would prefer to call it. That fluid is then going to participate in exchange, where again we do oxygen either loading or unloading depending on if we're in the lungs or around the lungs, or if we're in the big toe or wherever we happen to be. Nutrient exchange, hormone exchange, all of that stuff happens between the interstitial fluid and the cells, and that fluid is created because the capillaries end up being leaky. And so it's important that you understand those capillaries are leaky, because that's going to set us up for chapter 20 a little bit later on. Okay, so mentioned there were a few different types. So continuous capillaries are the least leaky capillaries. Anytime we talk about, we want a barrier between things, like we talked about the blood-brain barrier back in A&P1. Later on, when we get to the reproductive system, we're going to talk about a blood-testis barrier, we're going to have continuous capillaries there so that your immune system has the least amount of access to those places so that we don't damage anything in those areas that are really delicate that might have special antigens so that we don't get autoimmune diseases in those areas, or at least we try really hard not to do autoimmune diseases in those areas. Fenestrated capillaries are sort of the Goldilocks zone. They're just leaky enough, not too leaky, not leaky. They got these little bitty pores in them so that we can have the plasma come out. Cells aren't going to be leaking out, and that includes prokaryotic cells, which are bacterial cells. Relatively large molecules can go ahead and pass through, but we're blocking larger pathogens and extra large molecules. Sinusoidal capillaries are the holiest or leakiest of all the capillaries. Giant molecules can pass through those. Prokaryotic cells can pass through those. And again, prokaryotes, that's bacteria. Any place in your body where your body needs to have the most access to blood to do its job, like the liver, that's where you're going to have those sinusoidal capillaries. But there's a risk that's associated with that, which is because bacteria can leak through, the risk of infection is relatively high. So we better have a really good immune system wherever we have those sinusoidal capillaries, which your liver does have a pretty good immune system hanging out there. So it's adapted for that. Okay. Coming back to that immune system hanging out in the liver. Anytime you see the word hepatic, that means liver. Macrophages, we already defined, 2 chapters ago at this point? Remember that word means big eater. So those are the monocytes differentiate into macrophages, and they can run around and eat things. A bunch of macrophages just hang out in the liver to deal with the fact that the capillaries in the liver are sinusoidal. So any bacteria that leak out, they're there waiting for them to just eat them when they leak out. Okay, capillary beds. We need to be able to control when blood goes to any given area in the body. One of the fun little quirks of our body is we don't really have enough blood to send blood to every part of the body all the time, especially when you're being relatively active. So we have ways to shut blood flow off to certain places in the body, and that's what we're going to be talking about here. So this is an arteriole, this is a venule, this is the capillary bed. This vessel that goes straight through the capillary bed is called a vascular shunt. Now, the capillaries that come off the vascular shunt, they have these sphincter muscles at the beginning of them. If we do not need blood to go to the tissue that this capillary bed is supplying nutrients to, those precapillary sphincters are going to constrict and close off the capillaries, and then we're going to look like this. So that since the capillaries are closed off, the blood is going to go straight through in the vascular shunt, and we're going to skip this tissue. So what I want you to think about is, if you're just sitting here right now and you're listening to this video of me yammering on about blood vessels, you're not currently using your quadriceps more than likely. So why do you need to send blood to your quadriceps when you're trying to think? You need to be sending the blood to your brain so that you can think about what I'm talking about. So the precapillary sphincters in your quadriceps, they have shut off so that your blood can bypass your quads and go to your brain so that your brain can think about what we're talking about. But if you were to get up right now and start doing some squats, because for the love of God, I'm the most boring person on the face of the planet and we need to get some blood moving or you're going to pass out, then those precapillary sphincters are going to open and the blood is going to start going through the capillary bed in your quads, and now your quads are going to have blood going to them again. But that means now your brain's not going to be getting as much blood as it was getting before. So there's a risk-benefit thing that's going on here that your body is constantly having to adjust to. It needs to make sure that it's sending just the right amount of blood to all the tissues, but it has to sacrifice certain areas pretty much all the time in order to get blood to all the different parts of the body at the same time. That's a weird way to say that, but that's sort of the way your brain's looking at it. Okay. This was something I sort of alluded to earlier. Why are veins called a blood reservoir? So remember, the lumen of a vein is really big. The pressure in a vein is very low. Those two things means that the blood can just sit there and sort of pool in the vein and hang out in the vein, and not go anywhere. If you start working out though, we can squeeze the blood in those veins through vasoconstriction. It's called venoconstriction when it's on the vein side, and get that blood back into circulation. That would increase venous return. So it's called a blood reservoir because we can let blood hang out there when we don't need it right now because you're just sitting there eating cookies or doing whatever it is you're doing. Also, I had mentioned earlier, you should be able to recognize the difference in an artery and a vein just by looking at them, even if they're not color-coded. Notice the thickness on the wall on that artery as compared to this vein. Also notice how the vein just tends to collapse. That's because its wall is so much thinner than the artery. Okay. What's the function of venous valves? So since the pressure is so low, gravity has an impact here. Again, nobody likes to think about gravity and how it works on you, but gravity plays a huge role on fluid dynamics and your body. Gravity wants to pull blood down to your feet, and all the fluid in your body essentially down to your feet. Now, arterial pressure is keeping the blood in your arteries moving away from the hearts because that's the pressure generator. But once you pass through the capillary beds, the pressure plummets, and now we're not shooting anywhere, and gravity has a huge impact, and it's trying to pull everything down as low and as close to the earth as we can possibly get it. So the venous valves are trying to make sure that once the blood makes it past a certain point, it can't fall back down past that valve, and it will stop at this valve. And then once you get up and move around a little bit, the blood will come up, and then there's another valve, so it can't fall past that valve. And then you'll get up and you'll move around, and there'll be another valve. So that's what they're there for, is to make sure there's checkpoints and they won't fall past those checkpoints. Okay. Varicose veins is also defined for you up there. Varicose veins happen because valves start to fail. So let's say that this valve right here started to fail. Well, that means that this blood started to fall back down, and the blood started to pool through here, and it started to distend the veins in this area. Well, that puts more pressure on this valve down here, and it makes this valve more likely to fail, which makes this valve more likely to fail, which makes this valve more likely to fail, and so on. And so it makes all the veins past that first valve more likely to swell and become visible. And so varicose veins happen because the valves fail and blood is starting to pool and it's visible. Once it gets to the point where it is on this, I'm going to assume this is a woman because 1, the legs look shaved, 2, it is usually seen in women, then we really do need surgery to fix this because this is going to impact venous return once it's this bad. When they first start out, it's usually just an aesthetic issue, but like I said, at this point, this is going to be affecting venous return and we need to fix those. Gross picture on the next slide, I'll warn you. Hemorrhoids. Hemorrhoids are similar to varicose veins, only it's in a specific location, but it's swollen blood vessels directly around the anus. They actually have a fairly similar cause too. When people become obese, or pregnant, which is sort of a weird weight gain type of thing, but it increases pressure in the abdomen. This can also happen as a result of chronic constipation. So a person will be having to do what's known as a Valsalva maneuver a lot, and that increases abdominal pressure. So anything that increases abdominal pressure, difficulty pooping, pregnancy, or obesity, that's going to cause increased pressure around the anus, which causes the blood vessels to expand and become inflamed. It can eventually rupture the blood vessels. So the note that I will give you on this is so hemorrhoids are usually itchy / painful when you have them. If you're ever wiping down there and you have bright red blood, it's usually not like something you need to be freaking out about, because if it's bright red blood, it usually just means you've got some bleeding right there around the anus itself. So you have a hemorrhoid that is bleeding. That's not life-threatening. If your feces turns black, that means you're bleeding in your GI system and your digestive system is actually digesting the blood. that's more problematic. And so bright red blood in the feces, probably not a huge deal unless it's a lot of blood. Black feces, you don't know how long you've been bleeding and you don't know how much blood is in there, and so you probably need to go see a GI at that point. Okay. Venous sinuses. So we've already talked about these a couple times. We talked about the dural sinuses back in AMP1, and we talked about the coronary sinus last chapter or 2 chapters ago. I don't even remember at this point. These are sort of big distended pool veins where blood from really important organs sort of drains into a large distended vein so that it can be emptied into another vein a little bit later on. So the dural sinuses collect blood and then they're going to send it to the jugular vein so that we can get emptied right into the heart. And then the coronary sinus, well, the cardiac veins drain the blood into the coronary sinus and then we'll go directly into the right atrium. So venous sinuses, yeah, they're just collecting pools essentially. Okay. One of the important things about your body is blood, of course. And so your body will very often have collateral channels so that if one blood vessel gets damaged, broken, separated, blocked, you will have another blood vessel that can still take blood to that area. Those collateral channels are called anastomoses. So a vascular anastomosis is a collateral channel, essentially. So let me talk about these pictures, essentially. This was a surgically created anastomosis for a person who was on dialysis. They went in and they connected 2 blood vessels together to give them more direct access to the blood for the dialysis. So in this case, it was a surgically created anastomosis. You do, however, have naturally occurring anastomoses for very important organs. This one is called the circle of Willis. This is not a happy, healthy circle of Willis by any means. The circle of Willis is found in the brain. There are 6 different vessels that help to supply the brain, and I think you can see why. The brain is, of course, a very important organ. If you were to get a clot in one of these vessels, not a huge deal. You still got 5 more vessels that can take blood to the different parts of the brain. So that's what an anastomosis is for. It's to help make sure we still have these other backup ways to get blood to various places. That said, even though your body is trying really hard to make sure we always have these backup ways, these blind alleys to get blood to other places, even so, if you do end up with a damaged or broken or blocked off blood vessel, there are some of your tissues that are just going to end up dying as a result of that, more than likely, because those blood vessels probably supplied some tissue that was its only supply of blood. I feel like I'm blabbering at this point. I'm not speaking as clearly as I would love to be speaking at this point, but while it would have merged eventually, there was some tissue where that was its only option for a blood supply. That's why strokes and heart attacks are still so deadly. We try to have backups, but your body is not awesome, amazing at backups. The other thing that I want to say while I'm here on vascular anastomosis is your body creates more blood vessels all day, every day. So I do want you to understand that your blood vessels are not static and that you do make more of them. That's an important feature that your body has. Okay. Arteriosclerosis and atherosclerosis. Arteriosclerosis means that your arteries are not as flexible as they used to be. Does lead to high blood pressure, essentially. As I said on the slide here, atherosclerosis is a specific type of arteriosclerosis where the reason that your blood vessel is getting harder or more brittle is because we're building up plaques in the wall of the blood vessel. Risk factors for atherosclerosis are a number of huge different things. I like doctors that describe it as 50% genetics, 50% burger. It's a combination of those 2 things. You could have the best genetics in the world, but if you feed yourself garbage, you're going to end up with plaque building up in your blood vessels. That said, there are people who have eaten a perfect, wonderful diet and they just happen to get crap genes and they end up with atherosclerosis too. So you want to do what you can to try to help your blood vessels have the best possible time they can, essentially. Let me make sure that's where I want to stop this one. Yeah, that's where I want to stop this particular video.